It was a quiet night. Ethan sat in his small, dimly lit apartment in the heart of a futuristic city. The sound of the rain tapping against his window was the only noise in the room. He had just finished a long day of work in a world that was rapidly changing. Machines, robots, and artificial intelligence had taken over most jobs, leaving humans to live on the edge of an uncertain future. Ethan, like many others, worked in a small tech company, fixing outdated electronics for people who couldn't afford the advanced technology. He wasn't special, just another human in a world that had forgotten about them. He often thought about how humanity had gone from being the masters of Earth to almost being irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep, he heard a strange sound, a low, buzzing noise that grew louder, as if something was warping the air itself. He sat up immediately, his heart racing. Something didn't feel right. The buzzing sound continued, followed by a sudden flash of bright blue light that filled the room. For a split second, Ethan thought it might have been some kind of glitch or malfunction in the electronics around him. But then he saw her. Standing at the foot of his bed was a figure, a woman. At first glance, she appeared almost human, but there were distinct features that made her anything but. Her skin had a faint, otherworldly shimmer to it, and her eyes glowed a soft, eerie blue. There were markings along her arms, strange symbols that Ethan couldn't even begin to understand. Her clothes were like nothing he had ever seen, sleek, metallic, and almost liquid in their movement. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and confusion. Ethan froze, unable to move or speak. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. Was she real? Was he dreaming? Or had the tech in his apartment malfunctioned in some way? But no, this wasn't a dream. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath shallow. Before Ethan could ask a single question, the woman, who he now realized must be some kind of alien, stepped forward, her eyes widening in panic. She muttered something in a language he didn't understand. The words sounded strange, harsh even, but there was a sense of urgency in her tone. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from outside, followed by the sound of something crashing against his apartment's outer wall. Ethan jumped out of bed, rushing to the window. Through the rain, he saw a dark shape moving quickly, hovering near his apartment. It was a drone, a massive mechanical insect-like creature, scanning the area with bright lights. "Get down," the woman shouted, pulling him away from the window just as the drone fired a laser, narrowly missing them. The blast shattered part of the wall, sending debris flying. Ethan hit the floor hard, his heart racing even faster. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan gasped, his voice shaking. He looked at the woman, who was now standing next to him, looking out the window at the hovering drones. Her face was tense, eyes darting from one side to the other, as if searching for a way out. "They're looking for me," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. "I didn't mean for this to happen. My device malfunctioned. I didn't mean to teleport into your room." She paused, as if debating whether to say more, then continued. "I need your help. They'll kill me if they find me." Ethan stared at her, still trying to process everything. He didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. She wasn't human, and the drones outside were after her. He needed to think, to do something, but his mind was racing, and his body was frozen with fear. "How do I help you? Who are they?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Arya," she said quickly, her eyes flicking nervously back toward the drones. "And they are the Enclave, a coalition of alien species that monitors planets like Earth. They believe your world is dangerous, and they've been watching you for years. They think your people are unpredictable, too strong for the galaxy to handle." Ethan was confused. "But we're just humans. We don't have advanced tech. We're barely getting by as it is." Arya looked at him with an expression that was both sad and serious. "That's exactly what makes you dangerous. You're underestimated, and that's what makes you a threat. The Enclave believes if they let you grow unchecked, You'll rise up and challenge their control. So they're planning to destroy Earth. Ethan's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Earth, his home, was going to be wiped out by aliens because they were afraid of humanity. It didn't make sense. But there was something in Aria's voice, something urgent, that made him believe her. The sound of the drones outside grew louder, more intense. They were closing in. Aria turned to Ethan, her face determined. I need to get back to my ship. If I don't return within 12 hours, they'll know I'm here, and the Enclave will destroy Earth. The only way to stop them is if I make it back to my ship and send a false report. Ethan swallowed hard, still processing the gravity of the situation. He didn't know anything about alien technology or galactic politics. But what he did know was that Aria was in trouble, and so was Earth. Okay, Ethan said, his voice steady now. I'll help you, but we need to get out of here before those drones find us. Aria nodded, pulling out a small device from her suit. She pressed a button, and a soft blue glow surrounded them. The cloaking device on her suit activated, making them both invisible to the drones. It was their only chance. As they sneaked toward the door, Ethan couldn't help but think about how all of this had started. One moment he was just a regular guy living a regular life, and the next he was caught up in something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. The fate of his planet was in his hands, and the only person he could trust was an alien who had accidentally stumbled into his life. But as they moved silently through the dark hallways of the building, Ethan knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back. He had just stepped into a war that could change everything. And they didn't have much time. The air was heavy with tension as Ethan followed Aria through the darkened hallways of his apartment building. The only light came from the faint glow of her alien suit, which shimmered with each movement. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat faster than the last as they made their way to the building's exit. The sound of the drones searching the area outside grew louder with every step. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though Aria's cloaking device kept them hidden from the machines. Aria led the way, her every movement calculated and precise. Ethan had never seen anyone so focused. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, despite being in a city she'd never been to before. It was like she'd been trained for this, like she had done it 1,000 times. Ethan felt out of his depth. He was just a regular guy. No combat training, no special skills. Yet here he was, trying to help an alien escape from the most dangerous group of intergalactic enemies imaginable. The drones outside had been searching for Aria ever since she had accidentally teleported into his room. She had explained it quickly, but it didn't make sense to Ethan. How could she, or anyone, just randomly end up on Earth? And why was her life worth more than his own? She had said something about Earth being seen as a threat to the galaxy, but it all felt surreal. He didn't know if he should believe her. But right now, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting her out of here. They reached the door to the stairwell, and Aria stopped, holding her finger up to her lips. Ethan froze, his breath shallow, straining to hear any movement. There was a faint whirring sound. One of the drones had flown by, its sensors scanning the hallway. It was close. Too close. Ethan held his breath, waiting for the drone to pass. His heart seemed to beat louder in his ears, but he didn't dare make a sound. The drone passed, and Aria motioned for him to follow. They moved quickly, quietly, down the stairwell and out into the alley behind the building. Ethan was beginning to get a sense of the danger they were in, and the closer they got to the edge of the city, the more real it felt. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the narrow alleyways. The streets were eerily silent, as if the entire world had been frozen in place. But Ethan knew better. The Enclave, whoever they were, wouldn't stop until they had found her. And him. Aria stopped in the middle of the alley, her head tilting slightly as she listened. Ethan did the same, but he couldn't hear anything. Not at first. Then a low hum filled the air, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was getting closer. They had to move faster. Arya grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward a nearby building. She pressed her hand to a small panel on the wall, and it opened with a soft hiss, revealing a hidden doorway. Ethan didn't ask questions. He just followed her inside. The room was small and dim, the walls lined with old tech equipment and rusted tools. It looked like some kind of abandoned safe house, a place where people went when they needed to hide. Arya activated a small control panel, and a map of the city appeared on the wall. The route she was showing him was clear. It led them out of the city and into the wilderness, where her ship was hidden. Ethan glanced at the map, then at Arya. "Are you sure this is going to work?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His mind was racing. They were running out of time. "I don't know," she said, her voice tense. "But it's the only chance we have." Ethan nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. They had to move, and they had to move now. The map on the wall showed a series of back streets, alleys, and underground tunnels leading to the city's edge. If they were careful, they could avoid the drones, but it was risky. The closer they got to the outskirts of the city, the more dangerous it would become. As Arya led the way out of the safe house, Ethan's mind was still spinning. He kept wondering how all of this could be real. Aliens, advanced technology, the Enclave, and the looming threat of Earth's destruction. He had been living a simple life, just trying to get by. And now he was wrapped up in something much bigger than himself. What if he couldn't keep Arya safe? What if they were caught? His thoughts were interrupted when Arya suddenly grabbed his arm, pulling him to the ground. He looked up just in time to see a drone fly overhead, its sensors scanning the area. Ethan held his breath, praying they hadn't been spotted. The drone passed by, but they weren't out of danger yet. Arya's face was serious as she motioned for him to follow. They had to keep moving, stay one step ahead. They moved through the city like shadows, slipping through alleys and hidden passages. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to keep up. The streets felt endless, the dark corners of the city closing in around them. He couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep this up. Finally, after what seemed like hours of running and hiding, they'd reached the entrance to one of the underground tunnels. Arya pressed a button on the wall, and a section of the ground shifted, revealing a steep staircase leading down into the darkness below. She gestured for Ethan to follow her, and he hesitated for only a moment before he stepped into the darkness. The tunnel was cold, the air thick with the smell of old concrete and metal. As they descended deeper, the sound of the city above faded, replaced by the distant hum of the machinery beneath them. Arya moved ahead, her glowing suit lighting the way. Ethan followed closely behind, every sense on high alert. It felt like they were moving through a forgotten world, one that hadn't seen life in decades. At the bottom of the stairs, Arya led him to a narrow passage that wound its way through the dark. Ethan's mind raced as they moved forward. How close were they to the edge of the city? How much longer would it take to reach her ship? He wanted to ask Arya, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. After what felt like an eternity, they finally emerged from the tunnel into a large open area. Arya stopped in front of a hidden door, her hand hovering over a control panel. She glanced at Ethan, then at the door. It was almost time. They had almost made it. Just as Arya entered the final access code, the sound of drones filled the air again. This time, there were more of them, at least 3 or 4, and they were close. Ethan's heart raced as he heard the unmistakable buzz of the drone's engines getting louder. He knew they didn't have much time left. If they didn't make it to the ship now, they were done for. Arya's face tightened with determination as the door to the ship slowly opened. "Go now," she shouted. Without thinking, Ethan ran inside, but he didn't get far before he heard the sound of something heavy crashing to the ground behind him. The drones had found them. He didn't know how much longer they had. The ship's engines roared to life as Arya jumped into the cockpit, punching in the final coordinates. "Hold on," she shouted as the ship blasted off into the night sky. Ethan barely had time to strap himself in before the ship shot out of the atmosphere, leaving the chaos of the city far behind. As the ship entered the black void of space, Ethan slumped back in his seat, his breath heavy. He couldn't believe they had made it, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. Ethan sat back in the cockpit of the ship, still in shock, as the city of his home planet Earth shrank into the distance. Aria, the alien who had somehow entered his life in the most unexpected way, was busy at the controls, her fingers moving swiftly across the ship's dashboard. Outside the small porthole, the sky was now a deep, empty black, with only the distant twinkle of stars to guide them. The ship's engine hummed steadily beneath them as it ascended higher, leaving the chaos of the city and the dangers of the drones far behind. But Ethan's mind was far from calm. He had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than himself. Aria had warned him that their problems were far from over, and she wasn't wrong. The drone attack had only been a taste of what the Enclave, the alien coalition, was willing to do to stop her. Ethan had been caught in something he couldn't understand, and it seemed that the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. "So, where exactly are we going?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the conversation light, though his voice betrayed the fear and confusion that was bubbling just beneath the surface. Aria glanced at him, her face serious but focused. "We're heading to a safe house in the wilderness," she replied, her voice steady despite the pressure of the situation. "It's hidden deep in the mountains, far from any human settlement. The Enclave will have trouble tracking us there." Ethan nodded, trying to wrap his mind around everything she had explained to him. Earth, his planet, was being watched by alien forces. The Enclave saw humanity as a potential threat, a species that could one day rise up against their control. And now Aria, an alien herself, was on the run, trying to warn them, trying to stop them before they could wipe out his world. He was just a small part of something much bigger, something terrifying. They spent several hours traveling in silence, the ship gliding smoothly through the vastness of space. The hum of the engine was the only sound, and Ethan found himself looking out of the porthole, watching the stars drift by like frozen fragments of time. For a moment, everything felt surreal. It was hard to believe he had gone from living a normal, ordinary life to being in the middle of a galactic conflict. "We're almost there." Aria's voice brought him back to reality, and he turned to see her adjusting the ship's trajectory. Her eyes were fixed on the controls, her expression calm despite the situation. "You should prepare yourself for the landing. It's going to be rough." Ethan's stomach churned. "Rough," he repeated, suddenly feeling a knot of worry in his chest. "What do you mean by rough?" Aria didn't answer at first. She simply kept her focus on the instruments, her hands moving quickly as she adjusted the ship's speed. "We're entering the atmosphere of a remote planet," she said finally, "and we have to break through its dense cloud cover. The ship isn't exactly designed for that kind of re-entry, so the landing will be bumpy." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. He had never been in space before, and the thought of entering a planet's atmosphere at high speed wasn't exactly reassuring. But there was no turning back now. Aria's fingers flew over the console as she prepared the ship for the descent. The exterior of the ship vibrated as the atmosphere started to press against it. Ethan's heart raced as he gripped the edge of his seat. A loud, groaning noise echoed through the ship as the heat shields worked to protect them from the friction of re-entry. The ship's nose tilted downward, and Ethan could feel the pressure as they plunged deeper into the planet's atmosphere. Outside, the once black sky began to glow with fiery orange and red streaks, and Ethan could feel the heat building as the ship sped toward the planet's surface. He glanced over at Aria, whose expression remained calm, focused entirely on the controls. Her hand was steady, guiding the ship through the turbulence. Ethan felt a twinge of admiration for her. She was an alien, but she seemed more human in this moment than he did. The ship shuddered again, and the noise grew louder. The heat continued to build as the outer hull glowed brighter, the friction from the atmosphere testing the limits of the ship's design. Ethan's grip tightened as he braced himself for impact. The fear was almost overwhelming, but he couldn't show it. Arya was depending on him to stay calm. "We're almost through," Arya said quietly, her voice barely audible over the roar of the ship. "Hold on tight." With a sudden jolt, the ship broke through the thick clouds, and for a moment, there was nothing but the vast, rugged terrain below. The ground looked wild. Mountains, forests, and valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see. This was no ordinary planet. This was a place where no one lived. No one could find them. It was perfect for hiding. The ship began its descent toward the surface, its engines roaring as Arya guided it toward a hidden valley nestled between two towering mountain ranges. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the landscape. It was beautiful, untouched by human hands. The mountains were covered in thick forests, their peaks lost in the clouds. A small river wound its way through the valley, sparkling like silver in the fading light. With a final burst of speed, the ship touched down with a heavy thud, the landing gear absorbing the impact. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The ship was on the ground, safe for now. Arya released the controls and turned to face him. "We made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. But there was still an edge of tension in her eyes. "We can't stay here for long. The Enclave will know we've landed soon. We need to move quickly." Ethan unstrapped himself from his seat, his legs shaky as he stood up. The ship's interior was warm and stuffy, but it didn't matter. They were safe, for now. Arya moved toward the ship's exit, activating a hatch in the floor that led down to the ground. As the door opened, a rush of cool, fresh air filled the ship, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and earth. The wilderness was vast, silent, and untouched. This was their hiding place, but only for a short time. Arya stepped outside, and Ethan followed her, the cold air hitting him like a wave. His boots crunched against the gravel as they made their way toward the edge of the ship. The wilderness stretched out before them, silent and watchful. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "We need to head deeper into the forest," Arya said, her voice low. "The Enclave has satellites in orbit, and they will be able to track our ship's location soon. We have to stay ahead of them." Ethan nodded, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear: their journey was far from over. The wilderness might offer them temporary safety, but it was only a matter of time before the Enclave would find them. And when that happened, there would be no turning back. They began to walk, moving through the dense trees and rough terrain. The forest seemed endless, and the deeper they went, the more isolated they became. Ethan couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep running. Would they find the answers they needed? Would Arya's mission succeed? As the light began to fade, they pushed forward, knowing that every step brought them closer to the unknown. The wilderness was a place of refuge, but it was also a reminder of how much was at stake. Ethan's world, his home, was in danger, and he was part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And as the stars began to appear in the sky above them, Ethan realized that this was only the beginning. The wilderness might offer them shelter for now, but the real battle was just beginning. The wilderness had swallowed them whole, its dense trees and tangled underbrush blocking out the light from the distant stars above. For hours, Ethan and Arya had been trekking through the dense forest, pushing forward without stopping to rest. The air was thick with moisture, and every breath Ethan took felt heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Arya, the alien who had somehow become his protector and guide, seemed unaffected by the harsh environment. Her glowing suit provided a steady light, cutting through the darkness, and her movements were precise and fluid, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Ethan, on the other hand, felt every step weighing him down. He was exhausted, his muscles aching, and his mind racing. He had never been in a situation like this before, and every passing minute seemed to stretch on forever. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world around them seemed to grow louder, the rustling of leaves, the call of distant creatures, and the soft crackling of branches underfoot. But despite the natural beauty surrounding them, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. The enclave was still out there, searching for them. And even though they had managed to escape their clutches for now, Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up. "Are we close?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from the long journey. He tried to keep his tone calm, but the worry in his chest was impossible to hide. Arya glanced over at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "We're close," she replied, her voice steady. "But we need to keep moving. The enclave will have already detected our ship's descent. They'll be coming for us soon." Ethan nodded, his stomach twisting at the thought of what was coming. It felt like they were running out of time. The wilderness had been their refuge, but it wouldn't protect them forever. And even though Arya had been the one to lead him through this journey, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had never been a hero, never been someone who fought back against the odds. But now he was in the middle of something far bigger than himself, something that could change the fate of his entire world. As they pushed through a dense thicket, Arya paused suddenly, holding up her hand. Ethan froze, his heart racing. They had been walking in near silence for hours, and this sudden stop felt wrong. Something wasn't right. Arya turned to him, her face grim. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "We're not alone." Ethan strained his ears, but the forest was silent. No distant calls of wildlife, no rustling leaves, only the sound of his own breath. But then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a low hum, a faint sound that grew louder by the second. Ethan's blood ran cold as he recognized the noise. It was the same hum they had heard from the drones back in the city. "They'd found us," he said under his breath, his voice barely audible. Arya's face hardened. "We don't have time to run," she said. "We need to fight." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Fight. He wasn't a soldier. He had no weapons, no combat skills. But Arya was right. If they didn't stop the enclave now, they would never get another chance. The hum of the drones grew louder, and the air seemed to vibrate with their presence. Arya quickly pulled out a small device from her belt and pressed a button. There was a soft click, and the surrounding area flickered for a moment before a cloaking field enveloped them. Ethan blinked in surprise as the forest around them seemed to fade, becoming transparent as though they were hidden in plain sight. "We have to stay still," Arya whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "If they detect our movement, they'll find us." Ethan nodded, his heart racing. He tried to steady his breathing, but the noise of the drones grew louder, closer. They were out there, just beyond the trees, scanning the area with their advanced technology. The fear gnawed at him. He wanted to run, to do something, but all he could do was wait, holding his breath and praying that the cloaking device would work. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them helpful. What if the drones found them? What if they were too late? What if? Then, suddenly, the humming stopped. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The silence that followed felt deafening, like the calm before a storm. He held his breath, barely daring to move. Arya's eyes were fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. "They're gone," she said after a moment, her voice low. "For now." Ethan let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt dizzy from the tension, his body shaking from the adrenaline rush. They had been so close to being caught, so close to losing everything. But for now, they had escaped. "Let's keep moving," Arya said, turning to face him. "We don't have time to waste. The enclave will be back with reinforcements." Ethan nodded and followed her as they moved through the forest again, this time more cautiously. The adrenaline from the close call was still coursing through his veins, making it hard to focus, but he did his best to push the fear aside. They had to keep going. They had to reach the place where they could make their final stand. After another hour of walking, the forest began to thin, and the terrain became rockier. The towering trees gave way to smaller bushes and patches of open ground. The faint glow of the stars above seemed brighter here, and Ethan could hear the distant rush of water. It felt like they were getting closer to their destination. But even as he felt the weight of the journey begin to lift, a new fear took its place. The closer they got to their final destination, the more dangerous it would become. The enclave wouldn't give up. They couldn't afford to. Arya stopped suddenly, her head tilting as if she were listening for something. Ethan froze, his eyes scanning the surroundings, but he couldn't hear anything. Then, without warning, Arya reached down and pulled a small device from her belt, throwing it on the ground. The device activated with a quiet click, and a barrier sprang up around them, shimmering in the dim light. "They're coming," she said quickly. "Get ready." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. The peaceful wilderness they had walked through for the past few hours suddenly felt like a trap. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, and the silence in the air grew heavier, thicker. Then a sudden explosion of light pierced the darkness as a drone broke through the trees, its sensors scanning frantically. More followed, their metallic bodies glinting in the dim light as they circled around them. Arya's voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the tension in it. "Get to the edge of the barrier. I'll hold them off." Ethan's mind raced. Hold them off. What was he supposed to do? He didn't have any weapons. But before he could question it further, Arya had already moved to the front of the barrier, her glowing suit flashing as she activated a weapon from her belt. Arya's hand shot out, catching Ethan's wrist before he could reach her. Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "You have to go," she said, her voice weak. "I can't hold them off any longer. You have to finish what we started." Ethan's chest tightened with fear and guilt. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't just run while she was fighting for them. But Arya was right. If he didn't make it to the extraction point, they both would be lost. "I can't," Ethan began, but Arya's grip tightened, and she forced a weak smile. "You can. You're the only one who can," she said softly. "Humanity's future depends on you. You have to finish this." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he didn't have time to mourn. Arya was pushing him away now, urging him forward. The drone was almost upon them, and Ethan knew he had to act quickly. With one final glance at Arya, he turned and sprinted towards the extraction point. His legs were on fire, his breath ragged, but he pushed through the pain. He couldn't look back. He couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. The extraction point was in sight now, just a few hundred yards ahead. Ethan's heart surged with hope. He could make it. He could get to safety. But the drones were still coming, and the path was narrowing. There was no time to waste. As he neared the extraction point, the ground began to shake beneath him. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing, but he managed to regain his balance and push forward. The trees around him seemed to blur, the sounds of battle growing more distant. He was almost there. But just as he reached the clearing, the ground gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees, the air knocked out of his lungs. The sudden jolt sent a shock of pain through his body, but he pushed through it, gasping for air. Above him, a ship emerged from the trees, its sleek form cutting through the sky. The extraction team had arrived. But before he could reach the ship, a drone's blast shot through the air, hitting the ground just inches from him. He scrambled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The drones were closing in fast. He wasn't going to make it. And then, just as everything seemed lost, the trees around him exploded in a flash of light. A powerful wave of energy shot out from the forest, knocking the drones off course. Ethan barely had time to react as the force of the blast sent him flying into the air. He hit the ground hard, the impact sending shockwaves through his body. But then, through the smoke and debris, he saw her. Arya stood in the center of the clearing, her suit glowing brightly as she unleashed everything she had left. The drones were scattering, retreating from the intense energy she was releasing. She was struggling, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she wasn't giving up. She was holding the line, buying him the time he needed. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't speak. The battle was over for him, but Arya was still fighting. She was sacrificing everything to make sure he escaped. With all the strength he could muster, Ethan pushed himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, his body battered and bruised, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. He had to finish it. He ran toward the ship, his body screaming in protest, but his heart pushing him forward. The drones were retreating, but the battle wasn't over yet. Ethan's mind raced as he reached the ship, the extraction team ready to pull him aboard. But he couldn't leave. He had to go back for Arya. "Go," he shouted at the team. "Get ready to leave. I'm not leaving without her." The crew hesitated, but Ethan's desperation was clear. They couldn't leave her behind. Arya had given everything for them to escape. He wasn't going to let her die in vain. "Prepare to land," the commander said, his voice firm. "We're going back for her." And with that, the ship turned back toward the forest, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead to bring Arya back. Ethan's heart was in his throat as the ship descended back into the smoke-filled clearing. He had to make sure they finished this fight. For Arya, for humanity. The cost of their triumph was high, but they would see it through. The air was thick with the tension of the unknown, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. The world around him had been changed forever, but now there was a strange, almost peaceful quiet settling in. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. The war had taken too much, and the cost was still fresh in his mind. But for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, something that felt like a new beginning. As the ship's engines hummed softly, Ethan looked out the small porthole. Below them, the planet stretched out, a vast, green expanse of forests, mountains, and oceans. It was a planet they had fought so hard to protect. A planet that had once seemed hopelessly vulnerable against the might of technologically superior enemies. Now, it felt like a symbol of all they had fought for, humanity's survival. A voice crackled through the ship's intercom, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Captain, we are entering the atmosphere of the safe zone. The final leg of the journey is almost complete." Ethan nodded silently, his eyes still fixed on the planet below. There was so much to be done, so much rebuilding ahead. But there was also something more, something that he couldn't quite explain. The war had taken everything from them, and yet it had also given them something they had never expected, the chance to fight for a future they could call their own. The ship began to descend, its systems humming as it cut through the atmosphere. Ethan could feel the slight pressure on his chest as the ship adjusted to the gravitational pull of the planet, and he allowed himself to relax for just a moment. The battle was over. The drones had been defeated. Arya was safe. They had made it. They had won. As the ship touched down on the new safe zone, Ethan's mind was already shifting. The extraction had been a success, and now they were back on solid ground. The threat of the Enclave and the drones was gone, but there were still challenges ahead. The people had suffered, and the world they once knew was shattered. Rebuilding would take time, and the scars of war would take even longer to heal. "Captain, we're on the ground." The commander's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a touch of relief. "Welcome home." Ethan nodded once more, standing up from his seat and making his way to the ship's exit. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. A new chapter for humanity. It was time to rebuild. It was time to move forward. As the doors of the ship opened, Ethan stepped out into the fresh, cool air. He blinked, adjusting to the sunlight as it bathed the landscape in a soft glow. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. They had made it. The ground beneath his boots felt solid, real. The earth was alive, the air clean and full of promise. He was standing on the soil of a planet that had survived, against all odds. Around him, the crew was unloading supplies, setting up the base for their new life. They had been through hell, but now, there was a sense of purpose in the air that he hadn't felt in a long time. People were working together, rebuilding, not just structures but hope itself. The war had taken so much, but it had also brought humanity together in ways that nothing else could. Ethan took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He was alive. He was standing here, and so were the others. They had won, but it wasn't just a victory against an enemy. It was a victory for humanity itself. They had shown that even against overwhelming odds, they could survive. They could fight. They could rebuild. He turned around as the rest of the team began to move toward the command center. The sky was clear, and the sunlight hit the edges of the mountains in the distance, casting long shadows across the landscape. It was a beautiful sight, one that he had nearly lost hope of ever seeing again. And then he heard a voice. Soft at first, but unmistakable. Ethan. He turned quickly. Standing at the edge of the ship was Arya, her silhouette framed by the light. She was leaning on a crutch, her movements still slow and careful, but there was something about her that radiated strength. She had survived. Against all odds, she had survived. Arya. He called, running toward her, a smile tugging at his lips. I thought. I know, she interrupted, her voice soft. I know what you thought. She reached out, and he caught her hand, pulling her into an embrace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Their bond had been forged in the heat of battle. And now it was stronger than ever. Together, they had fought and won. And now, they were standing on the brink of something new. I'm not sure how we'll do it, Arya said quietly, looking out over the landscape. How we'll rebuild. But I know one thing. We'll do it together. Ethan nodded. Together, we'll make it work. And in that moment, he realized that the war, the pain, the loss, it had all been worth it. The cost had been high, but they had emerged stronger. They had proven to the universe that humanity was not to be underestimated. It wasn't just their survival that mattered. It was their will to keep going, to keep fighting. They had endured. They had triumphed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. They would have to rebuild, to heal, to face new challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like they had a chance. A real chance to create a future worth living for. A future that would be built on the ashes of war, yes, but also on the foundations of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of humanity. And as he looked out over the vast expanse of land before them, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, a new era for humanity. The fight wasn't over, but now they had something to fight for. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would thrive. The future was theirs.